Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us on the Think Before You Hate podcast, where we will discuss the latest topics relevant to civil rights here in the city of Chicago. I am Alex Chavez of the Chicago Commission on Human Relations, and we are the city's civil rights agency. What we do is we work diligently to eliminate prejudice and discrimination here in Chicago. And we enforce the Human Rights Ordinance and the Fair Housing Ordinance for the City of Chicago. And today we have the great pleasure of speaking with our Deputy Commissioner, Kenneth Gunn, who will educate us on the history of civil rights here in Chicago. So, Ken, welcome. Will you please let our listeners know who you are and just introduce yourself?
Well, thanks, Alex. Again, call me Ken. I'm Ken Gunn from the Commission on Human Relations. I'm the first Deputy Commissioner. I've been with the Commission now for 34 years. I'm an attorney, a lifelong Chicago resident, proud graduate of Limblom High School. Stayed here at University of Illinois for undergrad and law school. Joined the Commission only a couple years out of law school. I've been there ever since.
Beautiful. Well, with all that being considered, would you please let our listeners know what you know about the history of the human relations movement here in Chicago?
Yeah. We really have to look back because we think in terms of human and civil rights as something maybe in the 50s or 60s, but it really goes way back. The Commission actually was started because of a race riot in 1919. At that time, there was a teenage young African-American boy who swam across the invisible line on the beach, right, into the white area of the beach, and he was basically stoned to death. And that set off a series of riots in the city for a number of days. Blacks and whites were killed, a lot of property destroyed. So from that, the mayor created the Chicago Committee on Human Rights.
Gotcha, okay.
In 1921, so it took 2 years to do that.
Right.
Okay. So that was the precursor to the commission. And you got to remember at that time, this was the first migration, during the first migration of African Americans to Chicago. You had a lot of blacks leaving the South, leaving farms and, the history of sharecropping to come to Chicago to work in factories and in the industrialized Chicago. But what did they face? Of course, discrimination in housing and a lot of racial problems. So to address that, and really the racial problems, the riots and the tensions, the mayor created the commission, again, as a precursor in 1921. Fast forward to 1943. The second wave of migration, this was during the time of World War II. You had a lot of the white workers were gone fighting the war, so there was a need for labor in the North. So a lot of blacks, again, came to Chicago to find jobs and find a place to live, which set off, more tensions. And it wasn't just Chicago, it was other urban areas of the North. Like one of the largest ones, there was a large race riot in Detroit, which kind of caught the attention of the nation, that this was an issue. Right? So from there, the commission, let's talk about, we say civil rights, we talk about human relations, human rights, right? Back then it was all about human relations. How can we get people from attacking each other, from destroying property? So it wasn't about civil rights. It was all about human relations. And that's why some of the older agencies like ours still have that name. People ask me all the time, well, why are you human relations, not human rights? And that's how, because we were founded that way. And others across the country were found the same way. So again, fast forward a little longer, we actually had a fair housing ordinance in place in the 50s, even before the Federal Fair Housing Act, right? So there was some work being done here in Chicago, but it wasn't until, we heard about this, civil rights law on a national level where it became more prevalent, more cities were involved, there was more of an impetus around it. And what I failed to mention, in 1948 was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That was created, through the UN. And that actually was a kickstart to a lot of commissions around the country. But again, back then, we were an agency who was developed to keep rates riots down, keep relations good, but it wasn't about civil rights. And now I got to fast forward a little further, a few more decades, and I'll go as far as Harold Washington. In 1983, he was elected mayor. He did a number of things to bring other folks to the table on the issue of civil rights. And actually under Mayor Daley in 1989, our current ordinance, as it is, was written and passed, made effective in 1990, which gave us the authority for the first time to actually adjudicate cases of discrimination. Before, all we could do is have people come file a complaint, and we try to get them to settle. But now with the new ordinance, we have the authority to hold our own hearings, give damages out, injunctive relief, make whole relief, just like any court. So that's kind of how the commission kind of started under this historical spectrum of human rights and civil rights.
Makes sense. Thank you for giving us the brief scope on civil rights here, or the human relations movement here in Chicago. Now, that leads me to another question. How has the civil rights landscape in Chicago changed ever since you started with the Commission on Human Relations?
I started in 1990, and again, I'll go back to Harold Washington in 1983. During Mayor Washington times, you're familiar with the whole council wars thing, right? There was a racial divide in the city. It really was. But even with that, Mayor Washington looked and saw that it was important to have other communities at the table and represented in city government. Right. And he created a number of separate commissions representing different constituency groups. So there was an Asian commission, Arab, Latino, women, immigrant, and refugee. So the focus wasn't solely on black and white issues. And under the ordinance, when it was finally passed under Mayor Daley in 89 and 90, he made those commissions part of the Commission on Human Relations. So part of our work was to make sure these communities, were being protected, that they were aware of the ordinance, and that they wouldn't have to suffer discrimination. And it gave them a seat at the table on policy issues with the mayor and with city government.
Yeah, perfect. Now, I'm just curious, since you are a lawyer, and what made you decide to pursue a career specifically in civil rights law?
It kind of gets back to the last question, in terms of what was going on in the city. In law school, let me go back to undergrad, actually.
Okay.
I was studying to be an African-American history professor.
Nice.
And I remember I was meeting with my professor at that time, and we were talking about some of the civil rights cases. And she was the first person to say, you ever think about law school? And of course, as a student, undergrad, I'm thinking, well, that's 3 more years of school. But at the same time, I'm like, well, you're thinking about getting a PhD to teach. So I started looking into it, and other people mentioned it to me. And that's when I made the decision I would go to law school specifically for civil rights. And I'll tell you a little tidbit. I remember when I got to the university, I was only there for a couple of weeks. I met with the dean, and he's like, yes, so Mr. Gunn, what do you want to do with your law degree? I said, well, I want to be a civil rights lawyer. And, and his response was, well, you'll be broke the rest of your life. I said, well, I didn't say it, but I said, thank you for that encouragement, Dean. So I got out of law school, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to be a civil rights lawyer. Okay, where do I go? Where do I work? All I knew about was the NAACP. I didn't know a lot about the agencies at that point. Okay. So it took me a little while to find a commission. A couple of years later, I did find a commission, and I came on as the assistant, actually, to the Commissioner Clarence Wood, who was the first commissioner appointed under Mayor Daley. And this was an exciting time because this was when that new ordinance was put in place. And Commissioner Wood wanted an assistant who was an attorney who could help shape the office.
Right.
And, because we felt like we were starting from square one. So it was a really exciting time. We had this great ordinance that we were all excited about. And what really stuck with me, too, in those early years, like those different commissions I mentioned became advisory councils. And I got to work with them very closely. And I got to work with other communities, the Arab community, LGBT community, but back then it was just the gay and lesbian community, right? And And I got to understand their issues and their problems and seeing how common they were. But again, here I am. I wasn't too far out of law school. And I remember speaking to the chair of the Gay and Lesbian Council at that time. And we were talking about a decision that the commission just made in a discrimination case involving a gay individual. And this person was very emotional about it. And he's like, and I'm like, what's the big deal? Okay. He's like, Ken, you don't understand. Only a couple of years ago, if you were gay in Chicago, there's nothing you could do about it. And then he told me he had been an art professor at a local school. They got wind that he was gay, he got fired immediately.
That's horrible.
Right. So that kind of helped me see, again, as we talked about the black and white issue,
Right.
the civil rights goes beyond that. And I started, again, as I work with these other communities, seeing how discrimination impacts the others.
Ah, okay. Yeah, that's very interesting. So, with all that in mind, how do you teach people about human rights and civil rights in general?
I don't know if
With your
you can
background,
teach, you can send people to classes and all that.
Mhm.
People got to experience it, They got to step out of their comfort zones to get to know folks who are different than them. I think as a lawyer, I would look at it two ways. You can have the soft touch where you expose people to different cultures, encourage them to learn about other cultures. And then if they don't, then we have the law. Okay.
Right.
You don't want to abide by the law. This is what's going to happen to you if you discriminate against others.
Right.
But one good thing I like to do in Chicago, we have a wealth of ethnic museums in Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
And if you go to any of them, they all tell the story, not just how they got to the United States, but how they came to Chicago. And it's so, so fascinating. I mean, they're wonderful. And then you see how the stories intertwine. And then you start seeing, hey, they're really not that much different than I am.
Right. Yeah. There are a lot of those museums that I definitely need to visit myself, especially being relatively new to Chicago. I hadn't mentioned this in our previous episode, but I am a relatively new Chicagoan. I've been here for 2 years, but I definitely love this city and definitely cherish the uniqueness and diversity of the population for the people here in Chicago. I'm going to ask you this one question, the same question I asked our commissioner, and I'm going to ask other guests throughout this podcast. In your opinion, what can our listeners do in their everyday lives to combat hate and discrimination?
My first suggestion is to stop being so ready to label people. And I don't know if that's human nature or something we learn, but as soon as we see somebody, we want to label them. This person's black, this person's white, this person's gay, this person's straight. And then we get frustrated if we can't label them. It's like, I don't know what that person is. We need to get away from that stuff. We're humans. And we have, again, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but we all have so much in common, right? So much. We all want the same things. Like I said, people came here for jobs. People came here for housing. People want good education for their kids. We all want the same things. And we can work together to get them. We really can. So let's stop labeling everybody and, take the time to get to know somebody different from yourselves, right? And the final thing I would recommend, you got to be a little bold sometime and challenge your peers and your family members and friends. When you hear the biased comments, the racist comments, the bigoted comments, and I know for me, since, that was my focus, civil rights, I started at a pretty young age doing that. And I remember challenging some people at my church who were like my seniors when they made different slurs. And I said, that would be offensive to this group. I said, really? And they're using a term they've always heard, but they didn't realize, no. So until somebody tells you that, you may not realize it. And then as you continue to do that, people will know, it's not cool to talk around him like that. And my kids have a saying, because they've heard me do it over and over again with other people. And even their friends, when they come to my house, like, stop it, Dad's about to go commish on you. So you watch what you say, right?
Right.
All right. So.
Yeah, that's definitely a great answer to that question because I feel it's just very normal for people when they're bystanders, not to anything even like extreme as a hate crime or blunt discrimination, but even the subtle jokes or subtle comments, whether it be in the workplace, at churches you mentioned, or any social gathering, to just kind of brush it off as if it's nothing. But if we all become better at being more self-conscious or conscious of what other people say and knowing how those comments could actually affect the people around you, then that's definitely a very effective way to fight hate and discrimination. It seems minor, but it's obviously very effective and can be effective, especially if you've developed a reputation as being the person that will not tolerate that kind of commentary or any language, which sounds like you've developed that reputation. Oh, he'll go commissioner on you. And I do remember hearing one quote: "If you think that you're too small to make a difference, try falling asleep in a room with a mosquito in it."
There you go. Yeah.
And yes,
I would add one thing too. There's a lot of organizations nowadays that provide bystander training, and we have a piece on our website, and it's specific to hate crimes and discrimination. But that kind of will give you an idea how to respond when you see acts of hate.
Sure.
And there are different ways. Like you said, you don't necessarily have to physically engage with someone, but there are ways you can talk to somebody, and there are things you can do. But bystander training is very helpful for that.
Right. And thank you for letting our listeners know about the bystander training. That's one of many resources that we offer on our website. So, Ken, as we're wrapping up this episode, is there anything else that you wanted to discuss and let our listeners know as we talk about the history of civil rights here in Chicago, or anything related to the topic?
Well, I always reflect back to our ordinance.
Sure.
Because, again, for me, it's so important because, like I said, in the past, we didn't have enforcement powers. And even with that, the ordinance was very narrow in terms of the protections it offered. Since, I've been with the commission, we've continued to expand the coverage to include other groups. So, for instance, we had sexual orientation. So we added gender ID, gender identification. And this was because of the advocacy efforts of the trans community. Working with our Gay and Lesbian Advisory Council, they really educated us and the city about the issue because nobody was really talking about it,
right?
On the city scale. So once they brought it to our attention, and I believe we had a hearing on it, we realized this is something that's so sorely missing from our ordinance. And this is back, I think, 2011, and we amended our ordinance to include it. We also included protections. The most recent has been for returning residents, so they can get jobs. Before, first of all, initially there was no protection on the ordinance, and then there was those very narrow protections where employers couldn't put things on job applications saying, check this box if you have, if you've been convicted of a crime. So it was called ban-the-box legislation.
Sure.
So we had that for many years, which was not effective. And I don't think we even maybe we got one complaint under that. But within the last couple of years, we amended it to be broader. Right. So in any phase of the hiring process, if you feel like you're a returning resident and you've been discriminated against, you can file a complaint.
Is that just in Chicago? Is that at the federal level? Or I'm just genuinely curious.
Chicago has it. The state, I believe, has passed it. It's definitely not federal.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing about having a local ordinance. It provides local protections. And particularly when we see what's going on in the country right now, it's good to have a city with strong civil rights laws.
Right. Okay.
And another area we don't talk enough about is source of income protection.
Right.
And for the commission, most of that we see by way of housing discrimination for people with housing choice vouchers, or what we used to call Section 8.
Okay.
In Chicago, it is illegal to deny someone an apartment or housing if they have a Section 8 certificate or housing choice voucher certificate, and they meet all the other criteria. But it's still blatantly done, unfortunately. So we need people to come forward, and when that happens, so we can help them. So those are areas where our law has expanded to include others and provide more protections, and we're always looking to do that.
Sure.
Okay, where we see there's a problem, we want to address it.
Of course. That's what we do. Well, Ken, thank you very much for your time and discussing the history of civil rights here in Chicago. And all of your insights have been very invaluable and very interesting to me and definitely for our listeners. And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning into the Think Before You Hate podcast. Just remember, if you or anybody you know feels that they've been discriminated against, they've been a victim of discrimination, please do not hesitate to contact the Chicago Commission on Human Relations. You can file a complaint online at chicago.gov/CCHR. Again, that's chicago.gov/CCHR. And we are on multiple social media platforms. We're on Facebook, we're on X, we're on LinkedIn, we're on Instagram, and now newly we are on Blue Sky. And that basically wraps up this episode. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time. And remember, until next time, think before you hate.